Welcome, everybody. We're going to give it a second here so that everyone can file in. I see someone's very excited to be here. All right, we got quite a few participants, and it's going to take a second for everybody to come in. And I love the emojis. Thank you. I still see people filing in. All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca DeWinter-Schmidt, and I am the Associate Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. Welcome to our investor briefing, Mandating Due Diligence in the EU and Beyond. Where are we now? How did we get here? And where do we go? This is being co-hosted by the Investor Alliance, our parent organization, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and the World Benchmarking Alliance. For the next 75 minutes, we will be exploring a significant milestone that many of us in the business and human rights community have been advocating for many years, namely the mandating of human rights and environmental due diligence in the European Union through the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CSDDD for short, which was approved last Wednesday by the European Parliament. But before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few logistical matters. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all of those who have registered and will be made available on the Investor Alliance and website and YouTube channel. You are all on mute and in listen-only mode, but there will be a Q&A session at the end after we hear from our speakers, and you can pose questions in the Q&A box. The chat function has been disabled, and feel free to pose questions at any time during the presentations. Very importantly, I want to express a big thanks to all of our speakers. Unfortunately, don't have time to share their impressive bios, but you will be hearing from the following. So we're going to start off with Richard Gardner, EU Public Policy Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And Richard will share with us the main provisions of the CSDDD, or as he calls it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He's going to talk to us about the process that got us to this point and the next steps in terms of transposition into national laws and implementation. Afterwards, we're going to hear from Hazel Ransom, Policy Specialist at the Principles for Responsible Investment. Hazel will help us understand to what extent the CSDDD's provisions apply to financial actors and gaps in coverage relative to expectations laid out in international business and human rights frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. She will also explain to us how the CSDDD fits within the larger sustainability regulatory landscape within the European Union. Then, as many of you know, France and Germany are two member states who already have due diligence laws in place, and we will hear from Irene Knoke, who's a researcher at Südwind, about what lessons we have learned from the German experience with the supply chain due diligence law. What has worked, what challenges there have been around implementation, and what can stakeholders such as investors ask of their portfolio companies in terms of implementation of due diligence requirements. That will bring us to our final presentations, which focus on advocacy efforts for robust implementation of the CSDDD. Richard is going to share with us some data that he has been gathering with regards to which companies are in scope of the CSDDD and what investors can expect of them in terms of their human rights performance based on data that's been gathered through the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. Joanne Bauer, co-founder of Rights CoLab, and Xavi Kininana, my colleague and director of the Equitable Global Supply Chains at the Interfaith Center, will share with us some new tools that investors have at their disposal to support them in their engagements with portfolio companies on their human rights due diligence performance. And then last but absolutely not least, Chris Potts, policy officer at the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, will speak to what civil society organizations can expect of governments and companies in terms of implementation efforts moving forward. What role in particular can civil society organizations play in efforts to enforce the CSDDD? And with that, I hand things off to Richard Gardner. Thank you all for being here today.
Thanks, Rebecca, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks to the Investor Alliance for Human Rights and ICCR for working with us on this webinar. As Rebecca alluded to, I'd just like to take you to kick things off to three parts of CSDD that may be of interest, looking quickly at the political process and a lot of the noise we heard over the last few months of how we got here, which helps frame the next part, which is moving into the main outcomes that we have so far, putting them in boxes of whether or not they were good or not, and then a brief nod to the next steps and where we're going to go to from here. So if we could please move forward, I think 2 slides. Perfect. Thank you very much. So, I mean, something like this doesn't happen overnight, and I'm aware there's a global audience probably with us today, so this slide may be of interest, but really we've gotten to where we are over the last 5 years, which maybe it is a testament to what it takes to translate something like the UN guiding principles or the OECD guidance into hard law, and how much work, effort, and graft goes into it, and political negotiations. This started back in 2019 with parliamentary hearings of European commissioners, and we're entering back into that cycle again this year, with parliamentarians trying to put pressure on commissioners to introduce a hard law on due diligence and business and human rights. It was something enshrined in the commitments in the UNGPs. Eventually, this was heard, and the Commission committed to do something. In order to do that, in 2020, they released a public consultation. And this point is important because this was one of the consultations that had one of the largest responses ever. Over 500,000 people responded all over the world. The data was 5 continents, virtually every country inputting, from civil society to companies to legal groups to everybody. So it was something that really garnered a lot of attention. Throughout the process, there was 9 European parliamentary committees working on it. There was about 3,000 plus amendments. There was various initial reports from the European Parliament to set the scene. And eventually, after all that, all we got was a proposal. And that was in 2022. And so from that date in February 2022 to right now, we've basically been working on a deal that has just come to a head now in the last few weeks. So if we could please move to the next slide. And this is maybe of interest for those not as close to everything that we see in Brussels and around it. But we went from having a deal in December to not having a deal to a deal being back on the table. This is of interest because of the fact that we're entering into the end of this Parliament and Commission cycle. For those that may not know it, we will have parliamentary elections in June. That Parliament will then select a new Commission that comes in first with the Commission President in September and then with the Commissioners in November. So this was really the last chance to get something like this done. And while we managed to get a deal in December 2023, as you can see there, these things usually happen with a picture of some sort on Twitter or LinkedIn at about 6, 7 in the morning. This was unfortunately borderline torpedoed in January and February. Essentially, a lot of governments got cold feet. A lot of companies, when this became quite real, started to get quite concerned. And so it looked as if this may not happen. And for those following European politics, or at least largely global politics, this is not the only law to suffer this kind of backlash at this stage. We then got to a point of February, March about whether or not this would actually happen. And what was adopted was really a delete until they agree. It's a very unofficial term that you won't see written down, to try and find a bottom line that actually could form the basis of a law that would at least embody the key international standards that we have around business, human rights, and the environment, and try and enshrine them into hard law. That led to the agreement on 15th of March in the Council, and then on 19th of March, MEPs ratified it and then ratified again only last week. And now we're looking to a final agreement on the 24th of May. And I will get into, in the final slide, the timeline for this, but this means we could actually see this published in the official journal as early as this summer or September. Next slide, please. In terms of summarizing the final deal, there's kind of many ways to do it, but this was a way that we have been trying to group the various issues in terms of what we have, what is in there but not great, and what we've missed out on. You may have seen in the first slide, this entire law was actually phrased as a sustainable corporate governance initiative, so very kind of more holistic and well-rounded. It was then narrowed into a due diligence file, and so this is kind of where we've ended up at the moment. The good, the bad, and the ugly, as Rebecca alluded to, is how we're looking at it. Even in its kind of slightly weakened form, or very weakened form, depending on your viewpoint, we still think this is a very important and really key law, given that it's actually translating international commitments into something hard and something that can be translatable to sanctions and to court cases, etc. I mean, the good for from our point of view is really that this is an overarching all sector law. So even though, PRI and Hazel will get into this later, there may be differences in how sectors adopt it, all sectors are in scope. And this is the first kind of law to do that overarching approach. It also looks at upstream and downstream due diligence. This is key, as there was many moves to remove this to just a supply chain and upstream due diligence law. There's also existing standards and existing laws that focus on the upstream, but this actually goes in both ways. It also expands on the known concept of human rights due diligence to human rights and environmental due diligence. So going that extra step and being more holistic, if we think about work around the just transition and what that's going to look like with the environmental and social coming together. I think crucially, at least from our point of view and the data we're seeing, and we'll highlight later, is that it takes the concept of due diligence and mandates stakeholder consultation, grievance mechanisms, and remediation as a key part of that. And that is obviously clearly coming from the international standards. It was something that was hotly debated, but the legislation tries to round them off and make them all completely dependent on each other. Where it steps out of the international standards is it mandates Paris and a Paris-aligned climate plan. This is quite crucial and one that was quite hotly debated towards the end. In the European reporting laws, we obviously have the disclosure of this plan, but this is actually mandating the adoption and alignment to it, and further guidance will be worked on to make that, to see how that can appropriately be brought out. And then finally, in terms of sanctions, it's quite strong in terms of for sanctions of not aligning to the law, it's up to 5% of global revenue. You can be fined by the local authority, and there's also obviously access to courts and liability of breaches of due diligence that lead to harm. So very much it's linked to the harm caused because you have not adhered to this law. In terms of the bad, this is where the law has been challenged in terms of its actual impact, and it's a part of debate and would welcome questions or comments from those joining on what they think about this. The final scope of companies, which we'll get into at the end, has been greatly reduced, and they've gone up to companies with 1,000 employees and 450 million turnover. These statistics are kind of based on a best feel of what will basically remove the burden from SMEs, but it definitely reduces the scope to where others, including ourselves, would have wanted to be. There's quite a long phase-in period for the law to be implemented. So first phase in 2027 and final phase in of 2029, depending on the size of company. This will be got into more in the next set of slides, but just the financial sector is not fully in scope. It's mainly there for upstream and climate plans. So it is wholly cross-sectoral in terms of initial scope, but not in terms of each of the requirements they have. There's no consistent reporting obligations in there or ongoing. The OECD guidance on due diligence is very clear. You have to have ongoing communication about your due diligence activities in order to inform people and communities of what's happening. This links the reporting communication to CSRD. So good it's there, but not as ongoing. And then there's no explicit inclusion of public procurement. Now, it's important to note the law itself didn't have that legal mandate to do this, but at the same time, it does include an indication of what governments must take into account when dealing with companies and how CSDD can inform those decisions, but it doesn't give an explicit mandate to embed human rights and environmental considerations into public procurement. And then the ugly, the things that were basically removed from the law completely, and this is around the corporate governance, sustainable leadership part. So final deletion of a director's variable remuneration being linked to sustainability performance. This was introduced to kind of give ownership in directors and senior level of organizations about the due diligence application. That's been removed, along with any sort of those processes for that decision making and that kind of accountability towards senior roles. And then also the climate due diligence. While climate is still there, and while there is an obligation to have a Paris-aligned plan, linking that directly to the due diligence process is a bit murky in the analysis we've done. So not as strong as it could have been, given that the idea is to have a strong transition plan that will align to 1.5 degrees. So that to us is quite an ugly miss at this stage. Next slide, please. And then just in terms of where it aligns with the UNGPs, I mean, broadly speaking, it does, but just to build on the previous slide, you can see that it actually goes beyond the UNGPs, even in its current form, in that it's aligning very clearly the individual steps of due diligence. So adopting the OECD approach of looking at the 5 steps and how companies must follow them. To again state, it brings the E into HRDD. So now HREDD is there. And it very clearly tries to streamline liability and sanctions for companies that are inferred to in the UNGPs, and it's outlined that there should be something there, but this actually makes it explicit that it's linked to the due diligence process itself. And I think that can be quite powerful in terms of how companies are pressured into adopting a robust due diligence policy that can be challenged both by investors, for example, or financiers, or also CSOs. And then just to the final slide, please. And in terms of the timeline for application, and maybe to one of the middle points I had around the BAD, there is quite a long lead-in period for this. We intend to see the council to finalize this text towards the end of May. That will hopefully mean it's published in the official journal, which is the legal point as to which member states have to start transposing the text. Hopefully that's published sometime during the summer or early Q3. That will mean that the first companies that will come into scope will be 2027. That's all companies over 5,000 employees with 150 1,500 million turnover. Then the second year, we go down a scale to 3,000 employees and 900 million, and finally 1,000 employees and 450. And in that sense, companies will have 3 years to get themselves together and aligned, and member states will start looking at transposing this pretty quickly, given the attention that's been on the law so far, but also to say the Commission has a number of sets of guidance that it needs to produce around sectoral adherence to this law, what it means for contracts, what it also means for impacted people, what stakeholder consultation looks like. So probably not a lot of public work left, but definitely a lot of private and bilateral pieces, both within member states and within the Commission to keep an eye on. So I think with that, I can stop there and pass on to
Thank
Hazel.
you. Thanks, Richard. And just really quickly, before we pass on to Hazel, there is one clarification question that came in the Q&A. Can you just clarify to what extent downstream due diligence is actually also included? There was a question that they thought this was something that was in part deleted.
Sure. So, I mean, at a very top level, upstream and downstream due diligence are included. Where downstream has been deleted, it's been the extent that you go downstream. So, what has been removed is the point at which which products are used or which the product is finally sold. The way we've interpreted it is that it's basically direct relationships you have downstream is where your main due diligence has to take place, but you do not have to follow it to the extent that you do on your upstream. And that's for the broad kind of real economy companies. For, as we'll get into later, for the financial sector, it's currently not there at this stage. So it's been it's been removed to the point of use and final sale.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Richard. And with that, I'll hand over to Hazel to talk to us a little bit about what this means for the financial sector. Thanks so much, Hazel.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. And in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to provide a spotlight on the financial sector within the CSDDD and the broader EU regulatory landscape on due diligence. Just before we move on to my first slide, I want to mention that PRI has published an investor briefing on the CSDDD this Monday, which you can find via the QR code on the slide or easily on our website, which gives you much more detail than everything I'll manage to cram into the next 8 minutes or so. But on that, if we can move to the next slide, please. So the CSDDD will apply to very large EU and non-EU companies operating in the EU market. And you can see the definitions for very large in the table on the left-hand side of the screen. It will also apply to parent companies and franchises. Again, these are also very large, and you can find the thresholds in our briefing note. Companies are defined as undertakings in scope of the CSRD and financial companies. Sorry, or financial companies and this includes credit institutions and other investment companies falling under pieces of legislation such as MiFID, AIFM, and UCITS. Now, as you can see, and as Richard also mentioned, these are quite high thresholds, and therefore the number of companies in scope of the CSDD is smaller than we originally expected when we started this process 5 years ago. So I think it's important to note that we see from PRI's 2023 reporting framework that 41% of European investors say that they already use the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and or the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises to identify intended and unintended sustainability outcomes connected to their investment activities. Therefore, we expect that many investors are likely to continue to conduct full risk-based due diligence and expect the same of their investees, whether they're in scope or not, given the benefits that due diligence has to risk and sustainability impact assessments. If we can move on to the next slide, please, I'll talk about due diligence requirements for financial companies, which Richard has already touched upon a little bit. Under the CSDDD, companies must conduct risk-based human rights and environmental due diligence by carrying out the actions listed at the top of the slides across their own operations, those of their subsidiaries, and where related to their so-called chain of activities, those of their business partners. Now, the definition of chain of activities is very crucial, and I'm sure you understand that because we already had a question on it in the chat. Regarding investors, it's really important to note that the definition of downstream chain of activities excludes the provision of services. Therefore, we can conclude the following. Firstly, financial undertakings, like all other companies within scope of the CSDDD, are required to carry out due diligence on their own operations and those of their subsidiaries. But regarding specifically the financial services or products that they develop or provide, they must only conduct due diligence on the actual or potential impacts from their upstream business partners. No due diligence duties exist in relation to their customers. This approach will be reviewed in a report to be published by the European Commission. In the text, it says something along the lines as soon as possible, but within at least 2 years. So we expect this to be published no later than September 2026. It will be accompanied, if deemed appropriate by the European Commission, based on their research, by a legislative proposal, which could change the way that investors are affected by the directive. If we can move on to the next slide, please. I also want to highlight a few other good points about the due diligence requirements for financial companies under the CSDDD. First and foremost is the risk-based approach. Now, as many of you will know, and as I heard a lot as PRI was engaging on this file, investors often have large numbers of investee companies in their portfolios or assess a wide range of companies for investment. So how can they do due diligence throughout the whole supply chain or whole value chain? The OECD guidelines covers this and already states clearly that investors in this circumstance are encouraged to identify general areas where the risk of adverse impacts is most significant, and based on this risk assessment, prioritize parts of their value chain for due diligence. Significance looks at severity and likelihood, where severity depends on the scale of the outcome, the scope, and the irremediable character. By that, I mean any limits on the ability to restore those affected to a situation that is at least equivalent to their previous situation. Happily, in line with PRI's and others' engagement priorities, the CSDDD also uses this risk-based approach, allowing prioritization based on severity and likelihood, and clearly stating that due diligence is an obligation of means, not results. This ensures that the requirements are practicable and proportionate and target the most significant harms. Investors in scope of the CSDDD may identify areas with a high risk of negative impacts across their portfolios by looking at factors such as geography or sector, and using this prioritize investees for further assessment and engagement. PRI has developed guidance on this prioritization to identify impacts, which should help investors carry out effective due diligence, and you can see it linked in the slide. The second point I want to mention, and again, it relates to conversations that I had with signatories throughout the engagement, it's in regards to termination of business relationships. So the CSDDD sets out a number of steps for in-scope companies to take to prevent and bring to an end negative impacts. However, if these don't work, as a last resort, the CSDD states that companies should terminate the business relationship with respect to the activities concerned if the potential or actual adverse impact is severe. However, again, a good result is it states clearly that prior to terminating the business relationship, the company must assess whether the adverse impact of doing so can be reasonably expected to be more severe than the original adverse impact. If so, the company is not required to terminate the business relationship, but it must report the reasons of its decisions to the supervisory authority and monitor the impact and periodically reassess its decision on whether further appropriate measures are available. So termination of business relationships is as a last resort, and it's only done so if the impact of termination is less than the impact as it currently stands. A few other points that I want to mention is non-duplicative requirements. So the final step of due diligence is communication about your due diligence practice, and this is covered by Article 11 of the directive. If you're in scope of the CSRD, however, you do not have to disclose under the CSDDD Article 11 as well. If you're in scope of Article 4 of the SFDR and not the CSRD, they also make sure that there's no duplicative reporting requirements between the two, or they commit to ensuring that when there's more detail provided on the disclosure requirements. Another area is the climate transition plans under Article 15 of the CSDDD. So this requires companies in scope to adopt and put into effect a climate transition plan aligned with the Paris Agreement, as Richard mentioned. But again, if you're in scope of the CSRD and you already disclose that you have a transition plan and disclose information about it, you'll be deemed to be in compliance with the requirements to adopt. So again, they've made efforts to ensure non-duplicative requirements. The final 2 points are collaborations allowed to increase the company's ability to conduct due diligence, and guidance will be published. The first set to be expected around March 2027, and it will cover topics such as how to conduct due diligence, responsible disengagement, how to identify and engage with stakeholders, and the assessment of risk factors, amongst other topics. So if we can move on to my final slide, I want to briefly touch on due diligence within the broader EU sustainable finance framework. As you can see, elements already exist in a number of pieces of legislation. The main due diligence related disclosure obligations for investors falls under SFDR. They must disclose the actions they have taken or plan to take to reduce their principal adverse impacts, known as PAIs, and disclose their adherence to international standards on due diligence. There's also detailed disclosure requirements under the CSRD via the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Under the taxonomy regulation, you have the minimum social safeguards, which links to international standards on due diligence. And under the Shareholder Rights Directive, in-scope investors must, on a comply or explain basis, disclose how they monitor and engage with investee companies on social and environmental impact. Now that's disclosure. If we look at the requirements to conduct due diligence, some of these already exist as well under the UCITS and AFIM delegated acts from April 2021. Under these delegated acts, in-scope investors must consider the sustainability risks and their identified principal adverse impacts when ensuring a, quote, high standard of diligence in the selection and ongoing monitoring of investments, and when managing or terminating any arrangements with third parties. However, these delegated acts and the original text that they look at don't provide any further details on the other steps of due diligence, for example, prevention, mitigation, or bringing to an end, or indeed refer to international standards. So given all of this, PRI actually strongly welcomes the inclusion of the financial sector in the CSDDD. As mentioned, co-legislators have made efforts to ensure that the requirements are practicable by the risk-based approach, amongst other things, proportionate, and that they don't duplicate other pieces of legislation. In fact, we believe that the CSDDD should complement, and in the case of disclosures, underpin the rest of the EU's regulation on sustainable finance. More broadly, and as I said at the start, many investors already conduct sustainability due diligence because it supports their risk and impact analysis and enables better informed investee engagement. However, we understand that some investors are further along in their journey than others, and some need a bit of a helping hand to get there. So PRI will continue to support its signatories to do this by providing practical guidance on how to conduct due diligence. As I mentioned, we've already published the first set of guidance on identification, and we'll provide more guidance on the rest of the steps in the coming years. And we'll also support our signatories by engaging with policymakers worldwide to create enabling environments for them to do this due diligence. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Thanks, Hazel. That was tremendous and really useful to kind of see how all these pieces fit together. Just one quick question. I know you had said that there's an effort to ensure that disclosure requirements are non-duplicative, but just one question did come in specifically on that. Is there not obligations for corporate disclosure under the CSRD before 2027? What is the difference between these two disclosure requirements, the CSDDD and the CSRD? Can you just maybe elaborate on that briefly?
So I think I think it's made clear in Article 11 that if you're in scope of the CSRD and you're already disclosing your due diligence obligations, you don't need to do any further disclosure requirements under the CSDDD. So you could say they're perfectly aligned. I mean, the CSRD is, out of all of those pieces of legislation on the screen, probably the closest thing to the CSDDD in terms of their alignment with international standards as well. But yeah, Article 11 makes clear that if you're already in scope of the CSRD and you disclose, then you don't need to also disclose under the CSDDD.
Thank you so much. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Dana. Germany has already had some experience now with regards to implementing a supply chain due diligence law. I would love to hear your perspective on what lessons have been learned in that process. Over to you, Irina. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you very much also from my side. I'm very happy to be here and share some of the lessons. I have to be very brief, so next slide, please. I jump rightly into the general findings. As you probably all know, we have the law in force since 2023, and since this year, we have all companies included with 2,000 employees and above. So the first finding, I think I can go pretty quick through this because it's probably very obvious to everyone here around. Regulation has a much higher impact than the voluntary measures we had before that. We had a lot of time running through voluntary activities with very little impact. And now with the law in force, we actually see a lot of activities and changes in human rights due diligence processes within the companies, which mainly concern the risk management system and the adoption of the risk management system, including human rights, and increased focus also on indirect and high risk suppliers and also higher quality of data. From moving from soft law to hard law also had, and this is maybe a more important lesson learned, of course, includes a higher involvement and a higher stake of the compliance department, where human rights due diligence was beforehand rather a matter of the CSR compartment. It's now the compliance much more involved. And this has positive and negative effects. The positive effect, of course, is that human rights due diligence gains much higher weight within the company's strategy, which is very important. But we also saw sometimes that it's maybe a different kind of lawyers involved in the whole process. Like maybe it's not only human rights experts or international law experts, but also lawyers in the compliance department might have a different focus, and of course also another task and responsibility within the company. So maybe it is a little bit understandable, but what we've seen is that there has been a huge tendency to simply shift the risks onto, in that case, to the direct suppliers. And that directly moves us on to, maybe one more before I move or explore a little bit more on the risk shifting. One other point that we heard rather from front runners, which is on the negative side as well, that some input of resources is also put now rather into compliance of the law rather than CSR activities. I mean, this is something maybe we have to keep in mind. But wherever companies were well prepared for the inclusion or for the adoption of the law and compliance, this was not a big issue. So next slide, please. Explore a little bit the problem of the risk shifting, which has an impact on the way in which the law was often implemented. We saw very often that obligations simply were passed on direct suppliers, especially for those companies that were badly prepared, that did not have a good risk management system within the company. Very often this happened via contractual clauses or code of conduct, where the obligation on human rights due diligence was simply passed in the contract onto the suppliers. This is mainly due to the fact that the German law has a focus on own business area and direct suppliers. There's also, like in the CSDDD, a risk-based approach, but it's not that strong as in the CSDDD, and indirect suppliers only really need to be addressed when there is substantiated knowledge on violations. So what happened very often also in the risk analysis is that many companies send out standardized questionnaires to all their suppliers. All tier ones were covered with those questionnaires independently of any identified risks. And whenever we had, like, for example, media coverage on negative implications of the law on small and medium enterprises, it was usually one of these often very extreme cases of a small local supplier with mainly local production who had to fill in a 60 pages questionnaire of their supply chain. This in a way also fueled the narrative of overload of small and medium enterprises, and was probably one of the reasons of the sudden change of the Liberal Party and the German vote. Of course, also in Germany, this is not how it's meant to be. The BAFA, which is the control authority, published a guideline precisely on that in collaboration within the supply chain, which clearly limits the transfer of obligations from the law to the suppliers. The law also, or in the guideline, explains that very clearly. The law foresees a risk-based approach and focuses or wants to see dialogue on continuous exchange also with suppliers. There's other helpful guidelines, for example, on grievance mechanisms or sector-based guidances are to be published, like currently on the transport sector, for example. But, and this is another lesson, and I heard that in, I think, Richard's presentation, the guidelines and handouts were not there from the very beginning. And I think this is an important learning, maybe rather from the political side, that a lot of things also on the implementation need to be fairly clear when the law comes into force or is being implemented. So yeah, we should really take that 3 years now or 2 years to elaborate very well on that. What are, and this brings us already to the last slide, please, to the challenges. And this could be kind of the implications for investors as well, because the remaining challenges in a way could frame the options for investors' engagement with companies. At a company level, we see that the main challenges are the transparency in the deeper value chain. Sorry, I missed that out on the slide, but I think it's one of the main challenges for, especially if you talk about the upstream or tier 1, 2 to N. Companies also see difficulties above all in areas such as taking mitigation and preventive measures, and there especially in the way how to engage right holders, and also implementing due diligence obligations for their indirect suppliers. So this is where we still see a lot of deficiencies and also challenges for the companies themselves. And I think addressing all these challenges would probably prepare companies also much better for the CSDDD. And this is probably what investors should ask for in the companies they engage with, to really address these crucial issues, because only then human rights due diligence can really be implemented in an effective way. There are some differences between the German law and the CSDDD. However, much of the processes that need to be implemented are very much the same. So it's also very much aligned with the UN guiding principles, and a lot of the processes are very much alike. So good implementation of the German law is most probably a very good preparation also for the CSDDD. However, the fear actually goes a little bit in the other direction. The other direction in that case is that we actually fear that the German legislation might be watered down again now that we have a different time frame for the CSDDD. And the main argument against the German law always was that there was no European law, which was successfully watered down now. So you don't need much imagination to foresee what the strategy of the industry lobby will be in Germany, probably water down again the legislation. And this is another civil society organizations. We were always searching for companies that would stand up for a strong legislation, and that would maybe also be one of the main options for investors to engage with the companies. There were always not many, but a few companies that spoke out for a strong regulation, and this is probably something we need more, and they should actually get the lead in the framing of the discussion. And another focus also for investors on companies' engagement should be that they focus on strengthening the European legislation or a strong national adjustment of the European directive. So this is also something that would be of great interest for us, also civil society organizations, to get more support also from company side. And it's probably also in the investors' interest that due diligence and more transparency in the value chains fosters resilience. Resilience is something we are talking a lot now in these times. So due diligence is probably the key to that. And so these would be the points probably for investors to engage with their companies. And with that, I finish and happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thanks, Irina.
Thank
Yeah,
you very
and
much.
yeah, thank you also. There's definitely obviously still work to be done in a rule for investors to make sure that there is really robust transposition. And there are indeed two quick just clarification questions. We'll have time to take more at the end. But can you just confirm what exactly is the scope of the application of the German law to the supply chain? Is it just restricted to tier 1 suppliers? The first question. And then a second question with regards to the points you made around risk shifting. Has insurance played a role in risk mitigation to cover possible claims or actions arising from non-compliance? I don't know if those are two questions you might be able to quickly address.
Well, the first one is very quickly, yes, it's the law itself, its application, it's only the own business area in tier 1, but if there is substantiated knowledge, and of course this is one of those little bit difficult concepts maybe, but if you get to know of high risks in your value chain, at least you the company needs to get active and find out whether the company itself is affected, whether and what they could do to mitigate the risks. So it's only if there is concrete knowledge on that. And the second question, I don't know, I missed that. You spoke.
And is with regards to risk shifting. Has insurance played a role in risk mitigation to cover possible claims or action arising from non-compliance?
I'm afraid I cannot answer that question. Probably some companies would do that, but I'm afraid I wouldn't know that.
Very well. No, thank you for that information. And with that, we're going to now turn things back over to Richard to give us a sense of what the numbers look like, who's covered, and what has the CHRB demonstrated in terms of companies' preparedness to implement these due diligence requirements. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Rebecca, and sure, happy to do so. And yes, if we could please move to the next slide. I think maybe many people have seen this on LinkedIn or therefore, but there have been organizations trying to get a handle of the numbers of what we're talking about roughly of companies. And I think the first thing to say is to give a hat tip to SOMO and the work they've done through Orbis and Eurostat. And they're very clear these are not absolute figures, but to give us an idea of kind of what are we talking about concretely with the number of companies that are going to be covered. There's always a lot of debate about whether SMEs are in scope, whether we're talking about 200 companies, 10,000, etc. There's about 26 million companies registered in the EU. So this initial analysis gives us a real concrete feel of kind of approximately what we're looking at the moment. And when you consider where we are to where we were with the initial proposal from the Commission, their own analysis, again, we're only approximate there, we're looking at about 13,000 EU companies to be covered by this law, with about 4,000 non-EU companies to be covered based on their assessments. And we're now, with the current scope, roughly speaking, looking at about 5,500 companies that are there. This will take a lot more analysis by SOMO and by others, but it does give a feeling of what the actual impact is going to be. And just before getting to the next slides, from a World Benchmarking Alliance point of view, what we do is we benchmark and assess the human rights performance of about 2,000 of the most impactful companies in the world, and we assess on our initial figures, and we're looking to fine tune this. Over half of those companies will be covered by CSDD, so we feel that our analysis of where they currently sit with their human rights alignment is a good snapshot of, in general, where the rest of the kind of 4,000 or so companies sit, and allow us to see how much work has to be done within the next 3 years. So if you just move to the next slide, please. And I think looking at kind of 3 areas, so we're looking at stakeholder engagement, grievance mechanism, and engagement with the supply chain as key points of the law that companies have to look at. In terms of CSDD and what will it do for meaningful stakeholder engagement, this is a key point. I think in general, what's good is that about 61% of the companies we look at have some sort of human rights due diligence steps in place, so there won't be starting from nothing. But what's really worrying is then much less than a third actually have evidence of kind of meaningful engagement with rights holders, with stakeholders, etc. So for this to become, and rightly so, a legal requirement, that is going to take a significant step up for companies, and it's going to be something that they're really going to need to engage on and work on quite quickly, because it's clearly lacking in the data that we see at the moment. And the next slide, please. Similarly with grievance mechanisms, here companies do have, based on our data, a large amount of them have some sort of grievance mechanisms in place, but what is kind of lacking is how they're constructed, who has access to them, and also the trust and predictability and the safety within them. So as you can see there, you know, a large number of companies have some sort of grievance mechanism in place, but we have about kind of 10% involve rights holders and stakeholders in their actual design. So if you think about what CSDD is meant to do, it's meant to have stakeholder consultation throughout the process of putting in place your due diligence system. That to us would include things like your grievance mechanisms. And so the design of these things has to be much more extended. And that is going to be a step up for companies. It's going to be a relatively new way of doing things, and a kind of an outward thinking way. And then there's going to have to be more effort made for trust in this. So from previous work, or I've done with organizations around land and environmental defenders, and inputting grievances without fearing reprisal or pushback from companies, that is going to be an additional large step. So while grievance mechanisms are mainstreamed, their design is going to have to become stronger, and companies are going to have to respond to it. And then the final slide, please. And I think here, this is one which is a little more tangential, but is key to the application of CSDD. So it is an engagement law. It is not about designing a good list of suppliers and a bad list of suppliers. It is about looking at where your supply chain is and engaging in that supply chain to alleviate the risks. And that's going to involve dialogue and ongoing discourse with suppliers. And currently, what we see at the moment is that there's the larger companies, which is the ones we monitor, they have huge expectations on their suppliers, in this case around human rights and gender equality, but actually only a small number of those actually have processes in place in terms of engaging with them to actually meet that requirement. So a concern that is there is that this law could leave the large players enforcing their own legal requirements on those not included within CSDD, and that is not the way it's intended. So the way we're currently reading it through the data available is that companies will have to up their game essentially, and have a bit of a way to go about how they engage with their suppliers in order to jointly try and address the problem, as opposed to just presuming or having an expectation that suppliers are meeting these demands, but not actually trying and helping them to do so. So I think throughout those three areas we cover, largely speaking, companies are trying to do it, but in order to be CSDD compliant or to raise the bar, there's still some work to do, and will have to be done in the next 3 years.
Thanks, Richard. And so it sounds like there is definitely some work cut out for investors in terms of engaging with their portfolio companies on these issues, be it in terms of how they engage with stakeholders, their suppliers, or the robustness of grievance mechanisms. So let me turn it over to Joanne and Xavi to talk to us a little bit about some of the tools that have been published or are soon to be published that can help investors when they engage with their portfolio companies. Joanne, over to you, and thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. It's really wonderful to see so much investor interest in this webinar, and it really shows that the topic has risen on the investor agenda as it should be. We have this legislation in place at last to address these risks that have long been known to many of the people who have joined us here. Investors have a major role to play in meeting their own human rights responsibilities, as well as, of course, ensuring that their portfolio companies are meeting theirs, and as has been said, and building that resilience. With the impending legislation in sight, a coalition of organizations came together in 2022 to develop tools to equip investors with the means they need to be able to discern the quality of the human rights due diligence that investees say they are undertaking. And in the course of those discussions, the idea of a human rights and environmental due diligence precision tools project emerged. And precision because the tools represent the pain points for companies in undertaking human rights and environmental due diligence. Many of the same challenges that Irene identified in her remarks. Next slide, please. So the tools are housed on a dedicated website in order to bring these tools to one space with a consistent message and language, cross-referencing across tools, and available in interactive pages along with downloadable PDFs of these tools. The website is not yet launched, so this is kind of a sneak peek of it. It will be launched next month. But when it is, it will be launched with the first of 2 tools, with the others to be launched successively over the coming months. And we screenshotted here the drop-down menu of the tools that you can expect to have. There 2 of these tools, the responsible contracting tool and the certification red flags tool, will be published with the launch of the website. The responsible contracting tool is already published, which you will hear about shortly. There will be a stakeholder engagement guide, which is now in the works, and we expect to launch that at the end of this year, as well as the remedy guide. So let's move to the next slide, please. So again, one of the first tools that will be available on this website is the Responsible Contracting Guide. This was developed by ICCR and the Responsible Contracting Project based at Rutgers University. As mentioned, the tool is already available on the ICCR and RCP websites, and in addition to a very helpful explainer, has several components such as a shareholder resolution template, a sample engagement letter, and a Q&A. So Chavi's going to speak to this momentarily, so I will leave that to Chavi to explain further. And Asaba, if you could move to the next slide, please. So Certifications Red Flag is a tool that my organization, Rights Collab, has led on. We know that third-party certifications are important ways for companies to show that they're meeting a high standard of conduct, which all market actors rely on: companies, consumers, business partners, as well as investors. But at the same time, we know that they are often imperfect proxies for that conduct. And standard setters themselves have been grappling with how to treat them in their own metrics and indicators development. So we've developed certification red flags to support investors in their corporate engagement, to provide this tool for them to expertly probe with their investees the choice of certifications, and to better understand that company's own awareness of the strengths and limitations of the certification that they're relying upon. There are 14 flags altogether across the 5 topics that you see here, and each flag has 3 elements. It explains what the flag means, why it matters to investors, and that includes examples of where risks have already arisen when that red flag was present, and when financially material risks, and then what to look for. So good practice examples of what investors can look for. We'll also have a section on the use case for the tool, which draws from 4 beta testing sessions we've held with investors during the drafting stage, including a session that ICCR hosted during their fall meeting last year. And for those of you who are on this call who participated in those sessions, we want to thank you again for that contribution. Next slide, please. This is my final slide, just to give you a sense of the timeline here, where we've been in the course of drafting and what's to come. I'd like to call your attention to the learning sessions that we're planning for Q3 and Q4 this year with investors, where we will be organizing interactive sessions with role plays and so forth on how to use these tools. We're calling them learning sessions because we too will be learning along the way, and we will finalize our tool based on the experience that investors have in using these tools. And these sessions, each of these sessions, will also inform the engagement script that I did not fail to mention on the first slide. The engagement script is effectively what we're seeing as kind of the backbone of this project that will take investors through an entire conversation with their investees around, so that they can not only ask questions, but be able to anticipate answers and continue that conversation. And that is something we will be developing throughout the course of the project. And again, that will be informed through our learning sessions. So we very much welcome investors on this call to join us in this. We are also planning an opportunity at PRA in person to preview the stakeholder engagement guide. So stay tuned for information on that as well. And I'll send this back to Rebecca. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Joanne. And these sound like really valuable tools. And Chavi, if you want to jump in here and elaborate a bit on the responsible contracting guidance that's already been published.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'll just take a minute or two just to talk a little bit about the investor guidance. So it has been published. It's available on ICCR's website as well as responsiblecontracting.org. And it is really a tool for investors to use in their corporate engagements, ranging from corporate dialogues to shareholder resolutions, on the concept of responsible contracting, which really goes directly back to the last point that Richard made, which was thinking with companies about how to engage in responsible purchasing practices such that suppliers can actually fulfill the obligations to which both buyers and suppliers, or that they both need to meet. Next slide, please. All right, so the guide has basically an overview of what responsible contracting is, which is really the idea that it is not the traditional sort of contracting approach of a buyer pushing down responsibility to a supplier and cascading all their obligations down, but it's really the buyer and supplier sharing the obligation for promoting human rights and positive human rights and environmental outcomes through the contracting process. And obviously, this is an area which on all benchmarks, the companies score very poorly on, because this gets exactly, once you've embedded in your contract, you can't just cut and run. And it starts to get at their purchasing practices and the bottom line. And the idea that they have to actually support their suppliers if they want the suppliers to be able to help them fulfill these obligations. So it goes over what responsible contracting is, why it's important, why it should be important to investors, and how it can help companies fulfill their HREDD obligations. It has a list of questions to pose to companies, as well as template engagement letters and shareholder proposals. And then we have a section on anticipated pushback, which were actually developed also in sessions at the ICCR Fall Conference with many of you, in very engaging discussions with role plays between companies and investors. Next slide, please. So why is this relevant for investors? Well, I think this entire session sort of illustrates the point. Many of the new laws, including the CSDDD and the German law as well as the Tariff Act and the UFLPA, thinking about responsible contracting and shared responsibility, which includes due diligence for both buyer and supplier, and contractually determined, will help with UNGP alignment and adherence to regulations, to all these regulations. It also really helps, just generally, responsible purchasing practices help with risk-sensitive corporate governance, minimizes supply chain disruptions, which obviously is good for corporate performance and governance. Next slide, please. Improves reputational standing, corporate performance on benchmarks, and also, the CSDDD, the responsibilities for investors are sort of less direct here, but there is obviously guidelines from the OECD on responsible business conduct for institutional investors that look at the responsibility for investors for due diligence in their own investments and in these corporate engagements. So we hope we'll use it as a resource. Please reach out if you have any questions.
Great, thanks, Chavi. And this sounds like a useful tool for addressing some of that risk shifting that Joanna was referring to, and really thinking about, how both companies and their suppliers need to share responsibility. So, and now, absolutely not last nor least, well, last but not least, we've got Chris, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the civil society perspective. What is the road ahead? We've reached this landmark, but we obviously need to ensure that this actually is implemented in a robust fashion. What does it mean in terms of what civil society will expect of companies and governments moving forward? Over to you, Chris. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rebecca, and great to speak to you all. Fantastic each time to see so many investors interested in this, the topic of what's happening with EU regulation, and thank you so much, all of you, for your support through the Investor Alliance. I know there's the support at various stages of the advocacy and campaigning has been really valuable. So firstly, I would speak about transposition, as many of you would know, and as other speakers have mentioned, after the 25th of March, when is the final council vote, member states of the European Union will then have 2 years to transpose the directive into national law, and they will be able to go above and beyond the requirements of the directive. So that's obviously something where an opportunity where ECCJ members and other European civil society groups will be pushing national governments, national parliaments, national executive governments to go further than the requirements of the directive. And so what are those key areas going to be where advocacy, campaigning, also on the side of investors, that could be very useful in the coming 2 years? Firstly, and most obviously, would be, of course, the inclusion of the financial sector and an expansion of the downstream due diligence duty requirement. That's first of all. To be perfectly honest, however, though, I think it's really quite unlikely that that would happen. What you would need is a very progressive government at the national level. Nonetheless, it's something that civil society will be pushing for. And if it's not something that we get immediately, it's something that we would like to start working on in terms of extracting national government commitments. You know, if they don't do it with the transposition of the law, that they should commit to doing it or reviewing it or looking into it within the coming years. So that would be, the first point of note for the transposition here. The second point, and where it's looking a little bit more realistic, I would say, would be in expanding the company scope. As I think Irina mentioned before, what we're looking at with the CSDDD is actually a smaller company scope than what's currently covered by the German supply chain law, because the German supply chain law does not have a financial threshold requirement for companies. It's just 1,000 employees or over, whereas the EU law has 1,000 employees plus the 450 million euro turnover. So some estimates estimate that we're going to lose up to 2/3 of the German companies which are covered. So that's a huge difference. Of course, we get a net win across Europe, but it's issues like this that are so the company scope, which national coalitions will be pushing for in the member states. So yeah, that's a bit of a big cost, a big price, which was paid for this final compromise package at the very last minute, which happened in late February. I would just add to what we lost in late February in terms of the final political deal, which is going to go through in a couple of weeks. Also on the downstream, because it was a question before, we did also lose not only the sale and the use of the product, as Richard mentioned, but also the disposal, landfilling and recycling as well. So in addition to this huge cut to the number of companies which are covered, we also lost that. And as Richard mentioned as well, the requirement to have financial incentives for directors to comply with the transition plan, the climate transition plan. So those were sort of the three big things that we lost at the last minute. And just for your information, I mean, overall, as Richard's slide showed, there's around about just under 6,000 companies in the EU that will be covered. This is down from an estimated 17,000 before the last minute cut. So yeah, just to let you know really what it costs to get it across the line. yes, indeed. So from a civil society point of view, we're focusing on the transposition over the next couple of years, the support from investors and other groups in expanding the company scope, in expanding the downstream due diligence duty, and covering the finance sector will be priorities at the national level. And then in addition, what will we be doing? The transposition is one thing, but then the implementation. So the CSDDD gives NGOs and trade unions and consumer groups, affected communities, various new legal rights. It was mentioned before as that as part of the due diligence process, the identification, the mitigation, the remediation, at each of those stages of the due diligence process, covered companies are going to have to consult with affected stakeholders. They're also going to have to develop grievance mechanisms to accept complaints. Irena mentioned that when we look at the German law, it only covers to the first tier unless they get knowledge from an NGO of something happening in the fourth tier. So that gives a role to NGOs to, expand the due diligence duty under the German law. In a similar vein, under the CSDDD, we have a list of the human rights that are covered, trade union rights, right to life, right to a living income. But if NGOs and trade unions flag to companies that there are other rights that are not necessarily in the first part of the annex that the company is likely to harm, then those rights become part of the due diligence process. So it's a little bit complicated. You have a list of rights, which is indicative, and they're certainly covered. And then you have a list of the conventions. And if there are other rights that are not on the list, that are in the conventions, that NGOs can tell companies, hey, look, you really are at risk of harming this right, then those will be covered. My point here is that there's really quite a dynamic role and many opportunities for civil society to be involved in the due diligence process, as well as the enforcement. So the enforcement, as we should all know by now, takes the court-only, judicial-only court enforcement of the French law and adds to it the administrative or authority enforcement of the German law. So the EU law now has two enforcement mechanisms. We have rights of victims, victim plaintiffs to bring companies before courts when harm has occurred, and also to seek injunctive measures. So not only to get financial compensation, but to say, hey, you've got to fix the environment, you've got to pay for the oil spill cleanup. Not only do we just want to pay out. So that's fantastic. We've got, new legal rights for civil society to take companies to courts for overseas harm. The other thing which we have, and Irena mentioned that in Germany, you have the BAFA, which is the agency which will police the company's supply chain. What we know is that the German agency, which was set up to monitor the Lieferkettengesetz, the German supply chain law, has about 160 dedicated staff. So for Germany, that's pretty good. Of course, we would like to see it being more. And of course, Germany has the largest number of covered companies in the European Union. But it gives you an idea of how serious an operation this is, at least for Germany. There are no requirements that other member states spend a certain amount of money or dedicate a certain amount of staff to their enforcement agencies. But that's a matter of political will at the national level. So I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Chris. That was really useful. I mean, certainly, obviously, this is a political compromise, what we got in the end, but it sounds like there's some real options to really push the envelope and that civil society actors are empowered to do so. So we've got about 6 minutes left. I'm going to hand things over to Xavi. I encourage everyone to open up your Q&A box if you haven't done so yet. Look, you'll see a number of our speakers have already started answering your questions. But Xavi, if you want to take us through some of the questions that have been posed. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. I'm going to try and cluster them, just in the interest of time. So one cluster deals with penalties. So the question is, I'm having trouble understanding when penalties would hypothetically be implemented. For example, would it be when a severe human rights violation comes to light and the company was found to have lacking due diligence procedures to adequately identify and remediate? Are there any examples of recent human rights violations in corporate supply chains that speakers think would have resulted in a penalty under this new law? And then adding to that, also, there was a question about penalties for non-EU companies and how those will be implemented. So does somebody want to take that? Go ahead, Chris.
Sure, thanks. On the first part of the question, so indeed, there is what is known as a due diligence defense for companies. We're not talking about strict or what's known as absolute liability in some jurisdictions. Companies, indeed, companies will have the opportunity to prove their innocence, let's say, by saying we did due diligence. We did the best we could is the standard. Unfortunately for us, for NGOs, they do have that defense, but indeed they do have that capacity. It is at the end of the day an obligation of means, not an obligation of results. The second part, civil liability of non-EU based companies. That's an interesting question. It's clear that we're able to sue EU-based companies in the EU, but for non-EU-based parent companies, it's unlikely that we can use EU courts at this stage. But that's another file. That's the Brussels I regulation on jurisdiction, whether or not EU courts have jurisdiction over foreign companies. But the thing is that to be covered as a non-EU company, you need a base in the EU, and you could, as you know, as a victim, sue that company. But then, of course, the overseas parent company could also close up shop. But then that would mean losing EU business. So a little bit of a question mark there on civil liability for non-EU companies. It's less likely, and it's less clear, I should say, at this stage than for EU companies.
Thanks very much. There were a number of questions around engaging stakeholders. People might also just have resources that they want to point people, listeners to, but any advice on engagement of stakeholders?
Should I take that? I already
Sure.
had some questions answered in the chat. I think currently, at least from what I see in Germany, this is not the stage where we are. We are really rather at the stage where companies have to include processes and improve their human rights due diligence, risk analysis, and so on. So real stakeholder engagement, if we're not talking about, say, employees of your own business area, is still not really seen in various, maybe very little cases, or where there has already been like a history of that. I think the first step would probably be a really good grievance mechanism that is aligned with the UN Guiding Principles effectiveness criteria, and where it's really accessible. There's a good management system on how complaints can be anonymous. There needs to be a good protection of the rights holders themselves, if necessary, and there needs to be good management and information system on the grievance mechanism or on the complaints, how they're being treated. I think this is probably the highest or the first step we currently can take. And in the longer run, I think what we really need is also, because there was a question also, and there would be a lot of chaos if everybody comes. We see that as a German NGO as well, if everybody contacting us, and it's really getting too much. How would it be with NGOs in the global south? So really a collaborative approach, I think, is also something that would be needed.
Great. Richard, do you want to jump in quickly?
In one sentence, to say you can look at for specific sectors, the guidance the OECD has outlines what stakeholder engagement will look like per sector, and also the grievance mechanism is exactly that, but also in the design of the grievance mechanisms that therefore brings things forward in terms of what good stakeholder consultation looks like. So when you're actually engaging, you're engaging also on the way you engage, not just engaging on how you're doing your human rights and environmental due diligence.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca to close us out, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everybody. This is such a rich discussion. I know there's so many more questions we all have and that we still need to answer, but we're unfortunately out of time. But I would just want to thank all of our speakers for being here today. As I said, we will make this recording available. There are some lovely resources out there that can really help you understand what's in the CSDDD. PRI, Hazel already mentioned the briefing that they've put out. There is a briefing by the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which is also very valuable, FAQ from Shift and more. So take a look, and I'm sure we will be having this conversation moving forward because there's a lot more we need to unpack. And as Chris has pointed out rightfully, a lot more we still need to do. We've made a lot of progress, but we're not at the end of the road. So thank you, everybody. Have a lovely day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.